People from UNESCO, people from World.
Another round of applause. Every time we just have to give a round of applause. The fact that we're back, it's just wonderful. And I couldn't be more excited that we get to feature our very own Hanna Schreiber here, who's been with the workshop now. I feel like it's years, Hanna, my goodness. But you've only been here, my goodness, what is it, 3 weeks now?
Since 1st of March.
1st of March. Okay, all right, a little more than a month, but you've done a lot.
Still a lot of work is ahead.
Well, we're really excited to feature one of those projects today, and we'll learn more about how it fits in with all of our other really exciting projects that are underway. So we'll be hearing today about her work entitled Inviting Whole Humanity to an Elite Club, Global Heritage Production Regimes and the UNESCO Heritage List through the lens of the Ostrom's concepts. And I've just been enjoying every aspect of this, including learning more about the crazy UNESCO process. So without further ado, Hanna, professor, of course, at the University of Warsaw, and hopefully first but not the last time here at the workshop. So that's over to you.
Thank you so much. So I will try to share my screen and start the presentation.
Out of the way too.
I hope it's visible. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Scott, so much for this introduction and for bearing with me for this month and for providing your helpful feedback here. I would like also to greet my colleagues from the University of Warsaw and especially my co-author Bartosz Pieliński, who is with us. I'm embodying here the work that we are doing both. So please distribute all remarks equally, like nice to me, bad to him, and most critical to Scott, who is mentoring. I would also like to greet a lot our wonderful contributors in my research grant, Julia Krzesińska and Katarzyna Piotrowska, who are also very important part of the team. So the plan of our presentation is to discuss the UNESCO Heritage List and to reflect a little bit about the tension, which is actually encapsulated already in the title of the list. They aspire to present the heritage of humanity, of the whole world, but at the same time, the lists have to maintain high standards and values. So they are kind of an elite club tool. What we aim here to do, and maybe it's a provocative, maybe it's a risky and dangerous approach, but nevertheless, if not here, where could we do so? We are trying to go and to propose approaching these policy tools as MetaCommons. And in order to do so, we will go through the subtractability and excludability concept, but we'll also reflect on credibility talk, which is quite important for all global regimes, not only heritage regimes. And we would like to convince you at the end that these global policy tools shall be governed also in a sustainable and effective way, and thus we can approach them as commons themselves. So we are discussing here two different regimes, two different tools. The World Heritage List is a regime that has a considerable and profound history already, and it's globally acknowledged. It was set up in 1972, and the list that I'm talking about is established in the framework of this list. And the second tool is the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity, which is about traditions and practices, so not material objects. And it apparently happened to be also recognized as very important tool. And both instruments are almost universally ratified. I mean, the Heritage Convention is universally ratified. The Intangible Heritage Convention is almost, it has 180 states parties. 13 are missing, including US, Australia, Russia, Canada, Israel. You can imagine, you know, all these troubles that goes around. So important thing to understand is how these inscriptions to the list are being made. So first state party that has ratified the convention selects heritage element from its territory. But important thing to note is that before it even selects a heritage element to the list, it first has to select from different cultural assets available in its territory something to be labeled as heritage. And we call it, using, you know, this sport terminology, two-step shot. Like the first you include something into national inventory and you call it heritage, and then you try to convince the humanity and the international community that it belongs to the heritage of humanity. So the state party selects, then prepares a nomination file. These files are being assessed by specialized bodies, evaluation bodies, expert organizations. Then the final decisions is back in the hand of states that are sitting in the intergovernmental committees. For the World Heritage Committees, these are 21 states. For the Intangible Heritage Committee, these are 24 states. And so we have the important process of selection here, but the selection is important to provide safeguarding. And we safeguard these elements by creating a common awareness that they belong to the heritage of humanity. So they are of greatest importance, and we share information. So we have 3 S's here: selection, safeguarding, and sharing information. And what happens at the end, I'm not gonna talk about it, but this is where my folklore and anthropology colleagues will find themselves, I think, very confident, is what happens on the ground. So this UNESCO effect, UNESCOization. So what happens to the heritage element that received heritage brand? Some critical people will call it even UNESCO site because of the overexploitation that is a problem then back on the ground. So what are the similarities and differences? I will focus on similarities here. We select in both listing mechanisms, we safeguard through this selection, and we share information. And in both lists, we observe this ontological transformation of heritage element that previously belonged to nation. Now it starts to be regarded as something belonging to humanity. So also to future generations that are not yet here. And actually the most important concept for this whole list that is being discussed years already is whether the lists are credible. So whether they credibly can represent the humanity and the world. And this is a slide that I shall not share because it's a risky one and too ambitious probably, but well, as I said, I found this community so friendly that if not here, then where? So we try to speak through this paper, which is still a very work in progress, as you could see, to 3 research communities and to 3 bodies of knowledge. So we want to discuss with the commoners, with the workshoppers, the concept of MetaCommons, the credibility and rivalrousness concept. We want to also expose critical heritage scholars to the Ostrom analytical approaches and concepts because they usually don't know about it. And we also aim to contribute to develop the reflection on global policy tools that is happening in the IR and political science. So it's probably too ambitious, but at least we try. So we present here the approach in which we think about the lists as tools that are resources, that are shared resources by international community, that are of course subject to social dilemmas, and this is the famous definition coined by Professor Hess. And because they are not the commons themselves, because they are not these heritage elements that I tried to present here, but they are used to govern the commons, we propose to call them MetaCommons. And I found this also so interesting to read in Professor McGuinness' paper, who coined the term mini commons. So probably there is a kind of a need to distinguish the levels of the commons here too. This is completely in progress. So this is rather a food for thought to our commoners, because we also believe that this heritage lists are only an example of different available policy tools and different available MetaCommons. We have found a paper, interesting recent paper by Uli Bari, discussing the global policy tools used to discussion on climate change. And these are listed here. Of course, we were not brave enough to propose other tools that could be regarded as MetaCommons for other fields of studies, but I think that it might be helpful to think in this direction. How do we govern, what are the tools available in this toolbox to govern the commons? And of course, you can imagine that heritage research is a very flourishing and broad area of studies, and there are plenty of scholars really great who do wonderful work in the field. However, as said, when it comes to the application of the Ostrom's concept, it is not it is not the case. The crucial researchers are Peter Gould, Enrico Bertacchini, and also other contributors like Zan, Buzio, and Re, who contributed to the book on cultural commons. And the recent paper that was also prepared by Professor Gould and Professor Bertacchini on using AID framework for heritage elements. But this is a very recent development. And in the meantime, I've found there are other researchers trying to develop their research in this area. So I'm happy to also communicate with them. So saying all of that, what we found also that this research, even if still in its infancy, is mainly dealing with heritage as commons, so heritage elements as commons. So not many people focus on the nature of the mechanism of the tools themselves. The most important author who really focus on what is happening with the list and around the list is Lynn Meskel, and she contributes a lot when it comes to the World Heritage listing mechanism. That is why we try to offer these kind of reflection here, how to think about the nature of the list themselves as global policy tools and as possibly MetaCommons. So we have discussed the concept of this invitation of humanity to an elite club. And by saying that the regimes are open to every state's party, and by saying that they are universally ratified, we can imagine that heritage regimes as such are public goods. But the tools that were invented within the regime, like the list, are definitely more linked to the club goods concepts, because you have to, it's quite, the excludability is easy, but the subtractability of the list is low, but not non-existent. And this is how we are going also to present it in a minute. So on this right side of the slide, we want to visualize in a way, in this classic pasture metaphor, how we think about the commons and about the meta-commons. So whereas the commons as these shared resources usually are focused on the grass, so we think how to keep the grass, you know, still growing and not being consumed by everyone on the pasture. When it comes to MetaCommons, we want to focus on its credibility. So the tools and the MetaCommons can exist and are only useful as long as they are credible. If they are not credible, if there is no trust that these tools are important and they are useful, then nobody will use them. So they are gone. And here we want to also invite you to look closely to credibility. I was recommended by Professor McGuinness to read a wonderful paper by Ashim Prakash and Matthew Potosky about club goods, and actually they talk about the reputational element of the club goods. And so I think this is something to be looked more closely to, but still I think that this credibility will be and connected to reputation will be an important element. So these are just citations of summary records that we have analyzed since 2006. After every meeting of Intergovernmental Committee, which takes decision on the inscription, we have summary records so we can follow what states regard as credible, what they follow as important for the convention and for keeping the heritage sustainable. And so the credibility talk credibility discourse is, I would say, a critical one, but it is understood in a very different ways. Sometimes it is interpreted as appropriate language of the convention. In other cases, it will speak about equality approach to every state parties. Sometimes it will tell us that careful examination of the files is something what keeps the list credible. So there are different strains in the credibility discourse. And this is something what appeared in this debate as important, that the inscription on the list is not based only on credibility, but there are sub-elements of credibility, which we called interdependence and deservingness. So does this element really deserve to be on the list? Does it deserve to be chosen by a state party to be promoted on the international level? So this deservingness is actually, it was very interesting to observe that the deservingness debate is happening in public policy, in social policy, when it comes, for example, to the aid for poor people, to healthcare, but it's not happening that much in the IR discourse. Or in the commoners, I think. So this deservingness, it would be a thing to focus and to look further on. And the other, which is not that easily traced, is this interdependence. Because once inscribed to the list, the elements are not regarded anymore as just sole elements. They are regarded in the context of the list. Yes, so they are starting to be recognized as belonging to a different community of heritage elements, so to the heritage of humanity. So we call it a meta-reality of the list, yes, where this ontological transformation into the heritage of humanity appears. So the tension here, which is around the excludability, is that at the same time, each owner of the list, which we call here state parties, wants to inscribe as many elements as possible, but also it has to be, the state party must be a guardian of keeping the list credible, because it will make no sense for a state party to inscribe a heritage element from its own territory if the list is not credible and is not regarded as important globally. And we have a problem of subtractability, as said before, and subtractability in this new common discourse, when it comes to knowledge commons, to cultural commons, mainly is treated as non-subtractable. These commons are non-subtractable. But we want to challenge this also because we believe, and this is also something what is visible in the heritage discourse, that sharing, for example, practices does not mean only good for especially indigenous communities, but also sharing practices runs these elements into overexploitation, into appropriation, and into different terrible intellectual property abuses that are happening. So subtractability on the level of heritage elements is something that is really a troubling factor, and it is researched very well. But how to think about the list as subtractable? And I will give you one example in a moment. We think that the lists are subtractable because of the overrepresentation of some categories of the inscriptions on the list. The list has no end, they are infinite, yes? But if you have 1,000 inscriptions, you carefully consider what you want more. So all these, I would say, creative solutions are happening. And here we have the example of this, which is the Historic Center of Warsaw, and the Historic Center, the Baroque Ensemble of Dresden. Warsaw was demolished and bombed in 1944 by the Nazi troops because there was an uprising in Warsaw against the German occupation. And Warsaw was completely rebuilt. And it provides us an example of an enormous conservation efforts. And as such an example, not as an authentic buildings, but this is on the left picture, it has been inscribed into the World Heritage List in 1980. And Dresden was also shelled and bombed, but by the Allies. in the Second World War. And in 1989, they have tried the similar thing to inscribe Baroque ensemble, the historic rebuilt after the Second World War city center, into the World Heritage List. And they were given a reply, we already have this category. So what they did, they were creative. So they found, if we cannot inscribe the historic city, the historic part of our city, let's go bigger. And they have inscribed cultural landscape of Dresden-Elbe Valley. What created terrible problems, because this Elbe Valley and they inscribed it in 2004, and in 2006, the Elbe Valley went into World Heritage List in danger because of the plans to construct a bridge, the one that you can see here, but was regarded as UNESCO as a threat to the authentic value of the Elbe Valley. And it was delisted in 2009. The bridge was opened in 2013, and there was a huge, discussion in Germany whether we are doing it good or wrong. So, finishing this story, I would like to conclude with some policy implications about the research we are presenting here for your critical feedback. We believe that there's some tensions and dilemmas concerning policy tools, effectiveness and sustainability can be approached through the language of the governing of the commons. We want to reflect more on these tools, and we think that this credibility issue is critical for these global policy tools. And we believe, after Elinor Ostrom, and we are fully convinced that there is no one panacea for everything, but at least better understanding of these tools that are used by policymakers might be helpful in finding some panaceas for some things. And the credibility talk or credibility debate discourse resembles a lot this famous also research about trust, which is considered as crucial for governing the commons at the end. And we think that linking trust with credibility might offer some kind of a new maybe path to focus on. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and we are looking forward to your critiques and remarks. And
thanks so much, Hanna. We might just stop sharing. We can
because I would like also to Bartosz, so he can also speak to. Sorry,
that's no problem. Lovely. And indeed, so the floor is open. I'll do my best to switch back and forth here between those joining us online and those in the room. So comments, critiques, ideas. Please get us going, Dan. Yeah.
Great presentation on that, and a very interesting project and a worthwhile one, I think. My points are more discrete than general about the approach to this. I think just a couple of them. When you think about the nature of the lists themselves, to me, it's more intuitive to think of them as congestible rather than subtractable. And it's the increased congestion of the list that may detract from the value, the reputational value of the lists. So just something to think about there. With respect to policy tools, I think one way of thinking about them, and I'm just seat of my pants here, is unknown technologies. Policy tools, to the extent they're created and they're found to be useful or freely available to anyone, they're in the knowledge commons, essentially. And a person you might want to talk to here about policy tools with respect to environmental policy is Ken Richards at SPIA. We can talk about Ken later. And then finally, when you talked about the Elbe River situation going across, I wondered whether whether they think about when they're making a decision on heritage status, are they taking account of the possibility that they may be restricting change? And in some cases, it's a very conservative kind of practice, right? They're saying, we're not going to change this ever.
That's true.
And I'm just wondering if to what extent do they actually think about, try to foresee changing circumstances that might warrant changing status or keeping the status but allowing exceptions, and how that itself gets done.
Shall I answer?
Oh, yeah, no, please go for it, Anna.
So I
try
would
to figure out the camera.
say that in the case of the Elbe Valley, this discussion went years long and it was very critical. Why? Because if you manage to get into this elite club, and then you actually, by your own choice, says we prefer to have less traffic in the city, which was the bridge critical for. And we do not care about this humanity heritage status anymore, which is considered worldwide as something we will all die for. That brings a huge debate, and there was a huge debate in Germany. And I was surprised myself to see, because Elbe Valley was only one of the listed elements until now. List functions since the 70s, and only 3 elements were listed. And among those 3, it was an Oryx reserve from Oman and the Dresden Valley, and in the last year, Liverpool. So of course, the restricting change issue was hugely debated, and the local politicians said, well, we have to think about the generations that are living in the city to make the city sustainable, to make the city more friendly for the communities who are living in the city. And of course, we had to have really strong arguments to just ignore the fury of UNESCO, because it was interesting to see that in these newspapers and articles, there was UNESCO is furious about the bridge, yes? So all these emotional things were there. And yeah, the debate about...
When they're designating it as a heritage site, this is already after thousands of years of management.
Yeah.
Right? So at what point do we stop? I mean, what's the point at which we say no more change?
Mm-hmm.
And who are we then to impose this on future generations?
So all these points were in this debate. Yeah, definitely. That's a critical thing here.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Yeah, then I think Mike was next, and then Charlotte. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan, for leaving me sort of a tough act to follow with this sort of notion of what deserves to be kept stable and what doesn't. So, but I'll not try to pursue that. This is very interesting work. We've had a chance to talk a little bit before, and a couple of days ago, and I really like, Hanna, the way you've moved to this clear distinction between a MetaCommons and a commons. And I'd like to push you on that a little bit, though, because you're dealing with a couple different research literatures. That was a nice way of laying out the commons, the IR, and the heritage activists sort of, or researchers communities, but they have different languages, different lingos, different terms. And I think the analysis as you presented here so far is still kind of using the commons literature, the commons vocabulary as the primary determinant of what factors you're going to look at, with your emphasis on subtractability and excludability, and even credibility a little bit in terms of how those two terms feed into credibility. When you go to, and that makes sense because the goods are the components sort of within a commons, and the nature of goods is very much defined by excludability and subtractability. But when you go to a MetaCommons and your components are, say, policy tools or policy instruments that can be wielded by different actors in the international arena, global discourse arenas, the critical concern there is not things like sustainability or credibility or credibility is important, but it's not subtractability and excludability. There's a whole other set of terms that the policy literature has come up with and criteria that are applied to the policy toolbox, if you will. I mean, it's humongous. It's a long list, and there's no consensus list, which makes it a little harder to work with than the commons literature. But there are things like transparency, things like directness or indirects of effectiveness, how coercive the factors are, how inclusive and fair they are, and things like that. And I wonder if you could sort of be a little more sensitive and look at a little more tied to that language and what sort of implications you think that would have for you, for your analysis here. Since you're talking to different research and policy communities, you've kind of got to make your own translations of the terminology in one to make it consistent and understandable to the people in the other groups. So it's like other communities. I'd like to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, that's not an easy thing. We have been discussing with Bartosz about it. We even created a form of a table where we were putting, the words and finding translations. That's still work in progress, but we see that there is this huge problem. So maybe you can advise us. We shall not even attempt to translate, because at some point we have to accept that different research communities speak different languages, but then the concept of interdisciplinary effort is somehow being lost. So I would say that definitely we will see this problem with IR people. I have been presenting a part of this research last week in the International Studies Association conference, and yeah, that was pretty hard to use the common, governing the commons language and make it understandable for others. So I do not have any good answer to that, unless that we seek some help. Shall we just refrain from this attempt, or maybe we should push? I don't know. Maybe Bartosz would like to add something. I would say it's a critical point, but we still have no real short and sweet answer to that.
Yeah.
If I could just follow up real briefly, it's not a question of how can you make sure you can use the common language to influence the other communities. It's more what's the right language for the problem you're dealing with. And do you need to use slightly different versions of the language to approach different problems, different aspects of the problem? Not just different communities, but different aspects of the problem. So in other words, I'm not sure the commons literature per se, and even the Ostrom research tradition per se, is going to have enough terminology, enough vocabulary, a big enough toolbox for you to handle all of these issues dealing with such a radically diverse set of actors in the global arena. And so just encourage you to I mean, it's great that you're building off of the commons literature, and that's why you're talking at this group, but in this workshop, but you may need to sort of have a little more eclectic kind of approach to that, to the use of language.
Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you for underlining and clarifying that thing.
Absolutely. There's been so much of the unit of analysis and the scale involved, and it should be, as we've talked about, polycentricity in some cases, IAD framework could be useful. Charlotte, I think, was next, and then we'll come up and we'll work our way this way.
Okay.
Great to see you.
It's so much fun being here, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
So
I
much.
wish we had more cookies. I'm sorry. Tragedy clearly on the plate.
I have some questions, just a couple that I apologize if they're not the questions that you're asking, but they generate these questions from. One is, so when the heritage sites are assigned, couldn't they also enclose commons, local commons? In other words, if you make a site, a heritage site, what does it do for the property rights of the local people that are using, used to using and managing that? So it seems you know, that could happen. All my other question is, you know, now with this, the development of other types of efforts to sustain resources around the world, and I'm thinking of assigning legal rights to rivers and to other natural resources. How does that run antithetical? Are they in sync at all? Do they know what, because this is really growing, this movement of assigning legal rights to natural resources. And it's just maybe beyond what you're interested in, but it just made me wonder if there was any synchronicity at all. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Just you can clarify this assigning legal rights to resources. What do you mean by that?
I think the first one was a river in New Zealand. We had a fabulous colloquium here about 8 years ago with somebody presented. That was the first time I knew about it. And then, good. Yeah, what's her name?
Julia Talbot-Jones.
Julia Talbot-Jones. And since that time, there have been legal rights assigned to rivers in Bangladesh and India and I believe Australia, mainly in the other hemisphere.
Okay, okay. I will have to think about it because it's, I don't have an answer to that question, but I will be happy to look into this research. When it comes to these local communities and the property regimes after the inscriptions, this is a critical thing right now, I would say. And this is, there is a huge heritage research running around the property regimes, how they are changing after the inscription. What is the influence? Is it UNESCO site or a UNESCO blessing? How people deal with this global presence in their heritage issues. And maybe I can only say that this is, I would say, a piece of a larger debate, how to involve non-state actors into state-driven regimes. Because this is not only about local communities, but also different types of local communities like indigenous peoples, which is critical, but not only. And it took years for UNESCO and, for example, for the World Heritage Convention to invite indigenous peoples in a formal manner. And it happened in 2017 in Krakow, where the World Heritage Session took place. So there are forums already organized where non-state actors can be heard and tell their concerns about what is happening to their sites, but it is very still in its infancy. And Katarzyna, she invented the concept of the forum for managers, for people who actually manage sites, who really do that stuff on the ground. And this forum is just a new invention. It for the first time took place in Krakow, and it's developing. So we are having also this problem in the Intangible Heritage Convention, because the convention says the heart of safeguarding are communities. We cannot do anything without them. They must, sign their informed consent to have their tradition inscribed. But after the inscription, there is no possibility for them to voice their concerns. Even more, the nomination files are submitted only in French and English. So if they have no chance to, that somebody prepared the file with them in their language, they are completely detached. They have no opportunities also to critically address and to raise international concerns, because they have no access, on the language of the very basic level to the language of the nomination, where states tend to inscribe wonderful safeguarding measures. But what will happen? What happens after? Yes, are there these beautiful safeguarding measures? Are they implemented? There is a monitoring thing, of course, in both regimes, but that is not that easy. So I would say it's a very large problem, critical problem for heritage regimes. And there are plenty of case studies regarding that. And it is, of course, all running around the concept of sustainable development. Yes, how you actually implement sustainable development idea into managing of heritage sites. So this is developing, and there is a bunch of literature to run through. Yeah.
Please.
With a second one, I think.
Hello, Anne.
I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist, so my vocabulary is different, and I'm not following all of your vocabulary completely there, but UNESCO does have a kind of a colonial heritage, which is, for example, the language issue that you just mentioned. I think I kind of stumbled over the slide where you said you avoid sensitive political issues. Good luck with that. And I am, of course, concerned about the issue of the participation of Indigenous groups and local communities, because if you work at the national level, you're working with nationalism that often oppresses local communities. And in fact, those communities that are required to provide authenticity, or it seems like you're substituting reliability, credibility for sustainability, for authenticity, and that seems like a better term. But generally speaking, nation states are not really excited about empowering Indigenous communities to be politically and economically independent and sovereign. So there's automatically kind of a conflict there. But what I wanted to mention is a process that has happened. It's an anthropologically described process, and I think it's happening at several levels of those issues that you're talking about, and it's called common difference. And I can give you an example. The example that was given originally for explaining this process was beauty pageants. And in fact, beauty pageants in Belize, where I work and where my husband works, in fact, this is his study of beauty pageants, which I thought was a midlife crisis, but actually it is science. And what he saw was that Belizean and beauty pageants are not as fashionable as they were. About 15 years ago, they were kind of exploding everywhere. And he was trying to figure out what's going on, because as you know, ideas about feminism are spreading. Why are there so many beauty pageants? And what he found in Belize is that people have this conversation about whether or not to put forward a beautiful woman who's beautiful by Belizean standards, which are not the same as global standards, or to put forward a beautiful woman who can win the contest because she's meets the global standard. And so the beauty pageant becomes a conversation about the interaction between the global and the local. And the values don't necessarily generalize, but what does generalize are the terms of the debate. So Belizean, generally speaking, a beautiful Belizean woman by Belize standards is shaped like a pear, with the large part of the pear at the bottom, as opposed to the global standards where the pear is turned up the other way. And that conversation is ongoing, but what is globalized is that beauty is now defined in terms of body measurements, hair color, eye color, height. Okay, so the terms of the debate have become globalized. And that's what UNESCO does. And that's what you're also talking about the next level of doing. So in China, for example, and I'm not sure where the boundary between tangible and intangible is, because for me, a building isn't heritage, all heritage is intangible. Yeah. But you are talking about landscapes, and those are pretty tangible. So I'm not sure what the intangible thing is there. But anyway, in China, apparently what's happening is that there is so much approval and economic support and opportunity provided to communities who can get their local site UNESCO inscribed, is that people are dramatically and intentionally homogenizing local heritage sites to meet UNESCO standards. So I would like to think that the tools that you're talking about might be able to be used to take this into account. But I do think that not sure sustainability is really an appropriate goal for an Indigenous community. We don't want people to have to live in aspect. We don't want people zoos.
I did some research on human zoos.
Yeah.
Many years ago. I was shocked. Yeah. Plenty of things that you raise. Let me start with from the end. So actually, your question is how global tools can really embrace local diversity. Yeah, this is a question. And I think that the door to this question is the credibility. Because if we want to keep this representative and embracing, we have to adapt to that. It must be diversified. Yes, it must be. And this is a really a critical problem for both lists. I have some slides, but maybe I thought I may use for the day, but just to let you know, the World Heritage List is dominated in almost 50% by inscriptions coming from Europe and North America. So how world it is and how representative for the world, but the debate on how to make it a credible and having credibility in the title of a global strategy for equitable, geographically balanced and credible lists is since 90s there. So I would say that maybe there is a never-ending debate about it and a never-ending push towards credibility that we cannot maybe achieve at some point and make everyone satisfied. But this is, so I would stick to credibility when it comes to diversity of, and when it comes to global tools. And of course, they have universalized our debate in a way. You have speak about the beauty contest in Belize, which I love so much because actually I call the inscription processes beauty contests for international relations. This is how it is all about. And I found it so funny to discover that in plenty different communities, that you would not even imagine. I was training at some point of my life soldiers about cultural property protection in armed conflict. And we were talking about, I didn't know what I did by saying UNESCO inscriptions. They were like, from my country, I have 40 inscriptions. Oh, we have 42. They were really competing about the numbers. Soldiers who are not heritage people, not researchers, like they were really crazy about how great their country is, because it was a multinational soldier unit, in terms of these UNESCO inscriptions. So I like the story about this ways of adapting our local standards and expectations of what is expected by global community, what is a beauty standard. Yes, this is exactly that process that we are in. And this is why states really have huge debates internally before they decide what to push to international level, which is what I call interdependence. Yes, because you have to understand what kind of context you will apply with your heritage. And the last thing that I cannot agree with is this, or maybe I understood you incorrectly, is about authenticity and credibility. They are not interchangeable.
Well, I think credibility is a better word.
But it's not for authenticity. I would even say that authenticity is a very devaluated word, if I use the English term correctly. I mean that it has received terrible, harsh criticism because
the same thing.
And
I agree with you.
Yeah, and for Intangible Heritage Convention, 2003 convention, it is considered as a taboo word because when you speak about authenticity, then you are immediately in this hierarchies about uniqueness, masterpieces, things that we wanted to avoid in the 2003 convention. Because when you speak about traditions that are important for identity of people, you cannot say, oh, this is authentic, this is not authentic. According to which standards, yes? So I would say that credibility is rather far away from the authenticity discourse, which is very valid, especially for the 1972 convention.
Did you have an interjection or did you want to?
Just a quick
Oh, please
comment.
go ahead. Yeah.
It may help to clarify I thought you were about to say the following thing, and you're halfway there. That when you described the heritage list inscriptions being particularly focused on Europe, it may help to the general analysis that I'm aware of about the ICH convention is that it's compensatory to the Heritage Convention, such that the credibility of the larger heritage regime was in such question that the ICH regime was brought online to allow for a greater number of total inscriptions from so-called developing world, where there were fewer physical locations, but a lot more vernacular culture suitable for inscription. So that your arguments about credibility are related in one level to the
So
the parallel histories of the two lists running side by side, but not at the same historical moment.
this is something we were focusing also about how Intangible Heritage Convention was a real response to this imbalance.
And the lack of credibility,
Yeah.
the lack of distribution.
Yeah.
of the Heritage, the initial heritage.
But the problem with this convention is that it starts, as you could see, the same story repeats. So ICH convention that was to enhance and to cherish the Latin American, African, Asian heritage, which not necessarily has to be material one, is started to be wonderfully exploited by Europe. So if you see here, the representative list of ICH of humanity is starting to dominate also other regions when it comes to Europe. So the story is repeating itself, despite this instrument was exactly against this story.
And it may help for those who are new to this, just to point to the pause button pushed on China. China being told, stop, too many.
Yeah, they have more than 30 inscriptions. They are, the leader of the list. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And, and that has to do, again, with relative power in the world, in this international system.
Just the application process itself seems incredibly onerous and really tough for some communities to be able to manage. And of course, calls into account the whole legitimacy point that you were rightly raising. Eaton, I think, was next, and then Jamie, and then Joyce. Yeah, please.
So I have a question about the definition or demarcation of the commons and the user. So like going to the basic units. When you talk about commons here, do you refer to the old city of Warsaw, or to the list, or to all of those sites? And then the users, are those the Polish people or humanity, or the people of Warsaw? Like I think the commons and the user is like the basic units of common analysis.
Well, we basically use the term commons to describe heritage elements, both tangible and intangible. So I would consider what the historic town of Warsaw a commons, whether it is a public good or CPR. That's a question that needs really like a deep focus on how it is being managed. And we use MetaCommons to distinguish the heritage elements from the tools that are used to govern the heritage element. That is why we applied this term of MetaCommons, yes? So the list is a MetaCommon as an instrument that helps to govern the commons, which are heritage elements.
So this way, basically, like the management of the commons is now a bit split between the people, the Polish people or more, but also like once you say this is an asset of the humanity, then humanity has some say.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we were discussing this regarding that humanity has no legal standing, actually. Yes, who represents humanity? Yes, but in that sense, this is very abstract. Yes, this is an aspirational character of that tool that shows that we take care about future generations. But saying that this is abstract, we must also connect the concept of humanity to sustainable development, which is not that abstract, because sustainable development origins, like in the 80s, were coined to embrace what we do now impact future generations. So we have to take care, and we need to be sustainable because of future generations, not only because of ourselves, yes? So I would say that, yeah, we are in a maybe abstract category, but it translates into very palpable results in the field.
I think that the Dresden case is an example of humanity or UNESCO, like putting a boundary. You cannot put a bridge, and if you are, it is no longer World Heritage. So.
Good points. So we're gonna do a lightning round to finish this out. So Jamie and Joyce, and then we have a provocative question in the chat here as well.
But the most important one I want to make is like, what does UNESCO do that people who, care for the thing or that receive the thing don't do? For instance, UNESCO also has a cultural memory of the world list, which I think is very similar to the heritage things. So you see all kinds of different musics. We see music, we see, indigenous, and we see like Bach, Mass and B minor, for instance, is one example. But like, what does that list do for the Mass and B minor that like the Berlin Staatsbibliothek doesn't do in preserving the actual artifact, or that all of these many Bach societies around the world are doing by performing the piece and keeping it alive that way, or that music history professors aren't doing in the classroom by teaching the piece, or that Bach scholars, like one of my advisors, do by writing about the piece, in ways that are audience friendly. So what does UNESCO do that these other initiatives aren't doing? So that might be
I would say that the Memory of the World is a famous UNESCO run program. So it's a list actually to which these 3 S's, selection, safeguarding and sharing, would apply to, because actually even that you mentioned these elements, you mentioned them because they are inscribed on the Memory of the World and because we know them. Yes, like the Copernicus first De Revolutionibus, the first book that explained to us how the world really functions. The manuscripts of Chopin or Bach, yes, or the Ringelblum archive, the one that kept the memories of the ghetto, Warsaw Ghetto, that was kept, and the Ringelblum archive is also inscribed into the Memory of the World. So I would say this is an instrument of a heritage type, yes, despite it doesn't use the term heritage. But we say that it is connected to this field of documentary heritage. And what does it do? What the other elements don't do? I'm not able to answer to that question because
it's a really important question to consider, I think. I have more thoughts, but later.
Yeah, I will think about it. Thank you. Thank you.
Bring it out afterward too. Absolutely. Joyce, yeah.
So a couple of things. It seems to me like this list is really more like the time element of the list. Like in 1972, it looked like this. In 1991, it looked like that. And I don't know if that's taken into account, because like, for instance, back to the example of the beauty contest. I mean, so the way that she described it, so when I grew up, it was, Twiggy, right? And currently my daughter is just launching a Lizzo shapewear line. Now Lizzo is a 3X, okay? So what has really changed is, from Twiggy to Lizzo in even the Western view of what is beauty, right? So I just offer that as how do you, yeah, you can govern the list, but where's the acknowledgement that the list is this snapshot in time to the current snapshot in time? Like, why do you just get kicked off? You're no longer, it was great. The pyramids, like what did they look like when they were built? That's another snapshot in time. So I'm just wondering if that can go into the governance of it.
Yeah, that's actually, we've just run into very interesting latest research paper on the dynamic nature of goods, and that actually even the excludability and subtractability, if we are obsessed with the criteria has changed, their interpretation has changed, and thus the list has changed in time. So the list is a dynamic tool, definitely. You are fully right, and we are trying to link this observation, which was not clear in the presentation, but we hope to make it clear in the paper. It's a paper by Rama Haji, I think. Two authors published recently in the Journal of Institutional Economics. A wonderful paper that actually also suggests that we have to have this dynamic approach to the goods topology. Yes.
So maybe you should inscribe the heritage list to the memory of the world list.
Yeah, that would be
Fundamental.
So if we can think of these lists like sports hall of fames, no one ever gets kicked out unless they all of a sudden become
or if they want
politically incorrect.
Yeah.
Storm again. And to finish, we're unfortunately pretty much out of time, but we'll continue the discussion for those who are willing and able. But there was a question, if you'd like to reference it, you can, but it was about, well, perhaps focusing on Russia's membership in UNESCO, and if there's any, to your knowledge, any actions being considered to perhaps.
Yeah. So right now, just this is a pure politics. Like now, so there is a pressure because the World Heritage Committee meets every year in a different country who is a hosting country. And this is a huge celebration of the humanities heritage. And this year, committee should take place in Kazan in Russia. And so, of course, we are right now in the middle of different pressures to say that we cannot celebrate humanities heritage in Russia that year. But it happens that it's not that easy to do. Polish government even is trying to make an argument that we should exclude Russia from UNESCO. It's super hard. I would only say that UNESCO disappointed me a lot by calling the war in Ukraine for, I would say, weeks, the development of situation. So unless the UN General Assembly really voted, and we could see only after the UN General Assembly resolution, UNESCO was brave enough to say that there is a war. And right now we are cooperating via UNESCO to safeguard Ukrainian intangible heritage. I am myself involved a little bit as a networking person, because at the end you have big programs, you have initiatives, but at the end what counts is person-to-person contact. So yes, we are trying to make some use of UNESCO with the help of people at UNESCO who not everyone would follow the main official narration, yes, but yeah, this is very complicated thing.
Similar debates about unplugging Russia from the internet. Right?
Yeah.
What a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Hanna. Thanks for everyone joining online. Wonderful work. And
Thanks
for those
to Bartosz and to Kasia and to Julia, they didn't take the stage today, but it was a collaborative journey. So thanks a lot.
everybody.